Well, we learned those sobering statistics yesterday. Gas prices helping the annual inflation rate in May soar to its highest level in almost 40 years in Canada to 7.7%. That compares to just a year ago. Year over year, gas prices are up 48%. Food bought at stores up about 10%. Same with fresh vegetable prices. Food bought from restaurants, well, that's up almost 7%. And accommodations for travelers, that is up 40%. Inflation is here. It's touching almost everything. These latest figures show inflation continuing to rise to historic levels. Energy price is up 35% compared to a year ago. We talked about gasoline already. So for more on the rising cost of energy and inflation, we're joined live this morning by Ian Lee from the Sprott School of Business. Ian, so great to have you back here on CP24 Breakfast. Not the greatest news to talk about here. I mean, we're talking about 40-year inflation we haven't seen for 40 years. Some people haven't even experienced this in their lifetime, but it's hitting hard and it's serious, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. Inflation falls most heavily on low-income people and people of modest income. Of course, it affects everybody. But someone making $150,000 a year is clearly not as affected by $2 a liter gasoline as somebody who's making $22,000 a year. I mean, this is very obvious, and it is very pernicious. It's very destructive because it affects everything, and I mean by that, including essential things that we cannot postpone. You can't stop eating for 6 months or 12 months because of inflation. You can postpone a trip, you can postpone, renovations to the house or something like that, but you can't postpone eating, and you can't postpone, using your transportation to take your kids to the doctor or to go to the grocery store. So this is really, really serious for a lot of people. And
realistically, Ian, most people can't really change too much about their driving habits. I mean, carpooling is a wonderful idea, but effectively depending on, where you work, when you work, it's hard to sort of coordinate all that kind of thing. So, when you're putting gas in and paying almost 50% more than you were a year ago, that is hurting right across the board. And there's a lot of criticism right now about the federal government's approach to this. We're the only G7 nation at this point that's not giving any sort of federal gas tax holiday. And then you had that speech last week from Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, which basically said, what we've put in place already, that's going to help you down the road. Everything's okay for now. What do you make of how the feds are handling this current inflation crisis? And I think we can call it that.
It is an inflation crisis. It is the worst since the 70s. I did live through it as a very young man in my 20s. I was a mortgage manager at the bank, and I saw the impact of inflation, excuse me, and then rising interest rates. And it was terrible. But to your point, yes, the government could. It is being done in other G7 high-income countries, OECD countries. They could announce a temporary suspension of whether it's the gas tax or the excise tax or the carbon tax. It really doesn't matter. There's multiple taxes. It's about 40% of the total price of at the pump, 35 to 40% are taxes. It's within the discretion and the authority of the Minister of Finance to suspend it for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, whatever, making it clear to everybody, look, it's going to come back. We're going to put it back on once the crisis is passed. And Governor Polas last night was suggesting that inflation will be moderating towards the end of this year because of the interest rate increases. So that's not a bad way to go.
Yeah, and we know in Ontario, for example, we're taking 5.7 cents off per litre starting July 1st through the end of the year. So it's happening at the provincial level, but federally, not so much. So let me ask you about that, Ian. Is there a counter argument to that saying, well, if you give that, for example, gas tax holiday on whatever, choose your tax, there's several you can choose from there. Does that sort of take away from the concern about inflation and say, oh, well, everything's okay. You can afford to pump that gas back in your car. So we'll kind of tick along and only sort of delay the problem, punting it down the road?
I'll tell you why I disagree with that argument, and it has been made. Chrystia Freeland made it. Well, we're going to make the deficit worse if we do that. That's not accurate, and I'll explain. The Government of Canada, in the budget this year in Parliament, said that they're going to spend $400 billion this year. So if you provide some temporary relief, let's make up a number. Let's say it's $10 billion of tax relief on reduced gas taxes. The government could very easily suspend the payment, cut payments, cut $10 billion of spending in some other part of that $400 in order to sterilize.
So do you think, Ian, then that it's going to be really a matter of when and not if there is some sort of relief announced by the federal government? I mean, the pressure is just going to build too much. This inflation, as much as it may moderate by the end of the year, for a lot of people, 6 months is a long time. For in fact, everyone, it's really a long time.
I am in absolute agreement. I think that the political pressure, and I don't mean from the politicians, I mean from ordinary Canadians, coast to coast to coast, it is just clobbering people. I mean, the people driving their trucks who are contractors, people that are taking their kids. The average Canadian drives around 20,000, 25,000 kilometers a year, according to the CAA. So, and we're the second largest country in the world. And so transportation is essential. It's not a luxury. It's not like in Europe where everybody's cheek by jowl, so you can there's all kinds of alternatives. Mass transit. We are not like that. We are this huge country with a small population strung out over enormous distances, and we are absolutely dependent on cars and trucks and so forth. And that's why I think that the government is going to have to cave in on this and acknowledge that they have to provide some targeted temporary support for people that are suffering from these extraordinary and most unusual gas prices.
And the drum beats for that targeted temporary support continues. Ian Lee from the Sprott School of Business. Always appreciate the insight. Thanks so much for being here today.